In part two of our presentation on race in American history, we're going to deal with the period from the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1787-88 through the New Deal of the 1930s. There are three places where slavery appears in the U.S. Constitution. The first is the Fugitive Slave Clause. It established the principle that northern states were legally required to cooperate in returning escaped slaves to the South. And this became extremely more controversial during the 1850s, after the Compromise of 1850 and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was extremely aggressive. It actually deputized some Northerners. It legally sort of drafted them to join posses to help capture fugitive slaves. And this drove a large wedge between North and South, even greater than the one that had already existed. The second place where slavery appears in the Constitution is in the Slave Importation Clause. It allowed Congress to ban importing more slaves from outside the country beginning in as early as 1808. And when 1808 rolled around, Congress did indeed ban the importation of more slaves. Now you might wonder, how could they convince the South to go along with this? Well, this is interesting. They were able to get this through because of the influence of the largest slave state, Virginia. Virginia was developing a surplus of slaves. They were interested in selling them to the newly developing southern states in the West. And they could do that more profitably if they didn't have to compete with other slaves coming into the country. So this was done for the economic self-interest of some of the southeastern states, especially Virginia. Now, the third place where slavery shows up in the Constitution is in the 3/5 Clause. And as we'll see in the next slide, this affects us right down to the present day. The 3/5 Clause counted each slave as 3/5 of a person in determining how many members of the House of Representatives that state would have. Now, the South actually wanted them counted as whole persons so they could have more membership in the House. The North did not want them counted at all since they couldn't vote. And this was a compromise between North and South. But without it, Thomas Jefferson of the slave state of Virginia would not have been elected president in 1800. So it had an impact early in American history. But the interesting thing here is how it continues to influence us right down to the present day. The South faced a dilemma. If they allowed the president to be chosen by direct national popular vote, one person, one vote nationwide, and they then denied the right to vote to slaves, then their role in choosing a president would be diminished because they wouldn't have as many voters in this nationwide pool of votes. On the other hand, there was never any way they would have even considered giving slaves the right to vote. So they wanted to continue to exclude slaves from the vote, but retain the power that the 3/5 Clause had given them in the House of Representatives. Well, they found a way to do that, and that way was the Electoral College. In this system, each state has a number of electoral votes equal to the number of their representatives in the House, plus 2 for their 2 senators. And that is the system we're still living with today. So now, slave states could continue to benefit from the 3/5 Clause in the choice of a president. Now, this has influenced 5 different presidential elections in which the popular vote leader did not win the election. 1824, 1876, 1888, and most important for recent times, 2000 and 2016. In 2000, Al Gore won the national popular vote, but because he lost Florida by 537 votes out of more than 7 million cast, he lost the presidency. And then in 2016, Donald Trump lost the popular vote nationwide by almost 3 million, but he won the presidency because of the Electoral College. Now, in the 19th century, white supremacy more and more became ingrained in both the law and the culture of the country. A milestone here is the Dred Scott decision in 1857, shortly before the Civil War. And here's a quotation from the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, who wrote the majority decision. He wrote that they, meaning blacks, had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. This is the highest law of the land as articulated by the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, the Vice President of the Confederacy, shortly after they seceded from the Union in 1861, said this: "Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." So there's no doubt about white supremacy being written into the law and the customs of the United States. And this is not just the Confederacy. As you saw in the first quotation, it affected the entire nation. Now, in the Civil War era, there's a very interesting question here. Only 25% of white Southern families owned any slaves at all. So the question is, how do you get poor whites to fight for the South? Well, the answer to that will take us back to the whole psychology of Bacon's Rebellion in the late 17th century. What the Confederacy came up with is to play up regional pride, to hate Yankees, to consider the war a war of northern aggression against the traditions of the Southland. They played up white racial pride, all in the interests of the elites. The idea of defending the Southern homeland, when in reality what they were defending was the system of slavery, which 75% of white Southern households didn't even benefit from. They also demonized the opposing leader. This is a tactic that political leaders have fallen back on time and time again in many different countries. It's also worth mentioning, though, that a good number of Southerners without slaves rented slaves for a time, say at harvest time, and became invested in the system. So they bought into it. They were bribed, so to speak, to get behind the system of slavery. And Southerners also had relatives who owned slaves. So there were a number of reasons why these poor whites were convinced to support the Confederacy. But the main reasons were racism, regional pride, and a drummed up hatred of the North. So the result was what is sometimes called a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And people have been conned over and over again into supporting wars which are working actually against their own self-interest. Now, after the war, in case you believe that racism was confined to the South, take a look at this poster for the Democratic ticket for president and vice president in 1868. The presidential nominee, it should be Horatio Seymour, was governor of New York, and their slogan was, look at this, our motto, this is a white man's country, let white men rule. This is one of our major political parties openly espousing white supremacy. Now, during Reconstruction, there was real hope for progress. There was some land redistribution led by General Sherman in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, land that had been abandoned by Southern landowners who had betrayed the Union and had abandoned the land, left the land. But they showed up sometime after the war with deeds, and they were defended by President Andrew Johnson, and a very promising experiment to give their former slaves access to the land was utterly sabotaged by this president. That was one of the horrible consequences of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. There were real voting rights for African American men. Of course, no women at all could vote during this time, but for African American men, they actually could vote during the 1870s. But then gradually, after Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, they lost the right to vote. It wasn't instant, but it was almost total, and we'll talk about that in the next few minutes. There were racist organizations, openly white supremacist, violent organizations, the most famous of which was the Ku Klux Klan, but that was effectively suppressed by President Grant in the early 1870s, only to reemerge in 1915. Now, the Republican Congress also passed a Civil Rights Act in 1875. It was very much like the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is still on the books, but it was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1883. It had banned discrimination in public accommodations like hotels or restaurants, for example, but the Supreme Court decided that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment did not apply to private institutions. It only applied to units of government, and therefore struck down the Civil Rights Act. Now, Southern white elites faced a new problem in the 1890s that we could call populism. The South was economically depressed during this time, and there were sharecroppers of both races who were angry as a result of this. And there was a party first showing up in presidential elections in 1892, coming out of movements of farmers, a party that united against large landowners and against the railroads, who were, the railroads, the banks, the large landowners were those who were oppressing a lot of poor farmers. And for a time, there were signs that black and white farmers might be ready to unite with each other against the elites. Now, if you remember Bacon's Rebellion, you should be able to predict what the response was. The quote-unquote solution to this was a new system of rigid racial segregation, which we know as the Jim Crow system. And the reading that you have from The Warmth of Other Suns will spell this out in significant detail. This was legally required racial segregation. It wasn't just custom, it was the law. It was encouraged when the Populists went down to defeat in 1892. And then in 1896, when they joined the Democrats of William Jennings Bryan, they were also defeated. And this opened the door for Jim Crow. Also, there was a very significant Supreme Court decision in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, and it enshrined the idea of separate but equal. And there, it was a decision over a Louisiana law that mandated segregated rail cars. An African American by the name of Homer Plessy brought suit. It was a test case to challenge whether this violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, since this was a law established by the government. But in the decision, 8-1, the Supreme Court decided that although they were separated, they were still equal because there were rail cars for both of them. Now, during this period, there was a significant erosion of voting rights for African American men. The Jim Crow system, as I said, defended and extended the same race-based psychology developed after Bacon's Rebellion. They're going back to the same playbook. Now, you will also read in an excerpt from a book called Slavery by Another Name about the convict lease system. So keep this in mind when you read that piece. It made matters worse. Let's talk about the assault on voting rights in the South. There were poll taxes charging for the right to vote. And of course, poor people, and that included the vast majority of African Americans, couldn't afford to pay that. There were property qualifications for voting that still existed in some places. South Carolina was notable for that. And that meant that you had to own a certain amount of property in order to be able to vote. There were literacy tests. You had to prove you could read in order to vote. One of the ironies was that even the county clerk's employees who administered the tests sometimes themselves were illiterate. And they were administered with enormous discrimination. If you were white, you didn't have such a hard time of it. If you were African American, you might be asked to recite the Constitution of the state of Mississippi from memory, for example. And even then, they would find an excuse to deny you. There were grandfather clauses. That meant if your grandfather could vote, then you didn't have to take the literacy test. Of course, for the former slaves, their grandfathers could not vote, so they were subject to literacy tests. There was disqualification for petty crimes, and that's a legacy that we still have to the present day. More on that in part 3 of this PowerPoint. There were any number of excuses why if you committed even the smallest crime, you would be denied the right to vote. There were white primaries. Now, in the South, the real power rested in the Democratic Party, and the general election between the Democrat and the Republican was kind of anticlimactic. It was a foregone conclusion that the Democrat would win in the South. So the real contest was in the primary election for the Democratic Party, but the Democrats were deemed a private organization, and therefore they had the right to set whatever rules they wanted to. And of course, the rules they decided to set in the South was to make this for whites only. And if all else failed, there was physical intimidation. And when you showed up to vote, voting was, first of all, it wasn't necessarily a secret ballot. You would put your ballot in the ballot box of the party of your choice. But the mere fact that you showed up at all to vote in the presence of, say, some men wearing white hoods was very, very intimidating. That could get you lynched, killed. Now, if these tactics were effective, we should have some evidence of this. And we do in the state of Louisiana. There's been careful study of this. In 1896, the evidence shows that more than 130,000 registered voters existed in Louisiana. By 1900, the number went down to 5,300. And by 1904, it had been reduced by almost 99%. This is the time when Jim Crow was becoming entrenched in the South, and disfranchisement of black men was rampant. Now, let's just get a quick summary of the kinds of offenses that were brought against African Americans. Now, I want to point out that there are 30 items on this list, and 28 of them happened after the official end of slavery. So, you know, when people say, well, slavery's been over with for 150 years, what are you complaining about? Well, there are plenty of things we're complaining about, because most of these offenses, most of these racial injustices were instituted after the end of slavery in 1865 and thereafter. Now, I won't go through everything on this list, but I would encourage you to pause this video or to go to the PowerPoint version and look at this, and please send us any questions that you might have about any of these things. We've talked about some of them already. Lynching, of course, as I said, is murder, and you could be lynched for any number of reasons. And there was no justice in the South on this, because the event was often broadcast, was publicized in advance. In notorious cases, there were even special train excursions to lynchings. The mayor of the town knew about it. The sheriff knew about it. In fact, they were likely participants in it. So this was utterly in violation of any laws against murder, because that's what it was. It was murder. There were trumped-up charges at any time there was any suspicion of an African-American man having any connection with a white woman. That was grounds for lynching. Regardless of whether it was true, regardless of whether the relationship was consensual, even a hint of that would be grounds for lynching. And even today, capital punishment and incarceration are applied far more commonly to minorities than they are to whites. Okay, this is a matter that I hope we'll be able to discuss in one forum or another. But you know, I would encourage you to go back to this list and comment or send any questions you might have about any of the items on it. Now, let's fast forward a bit to the New Deal, the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt. Racism was rampant in the early 20th century. Jim Crow was growing, and discrimination was certainly not limited to the South. Not even lynching. Lynchings existed in states like Indiana and a number of northern states. But I want to focus specifically on racism during the New Deal, because this was a time of progressive change in the country, and there were an enormous number of real accomplishments that President Roosevelt deserves credit for. But there's a dark side of this that we need to talk about. He needed the votes of Southern Democrats, and for that matter, a lot of racist Northerners to pass legislation. This may be useful legislation, like Social Security, for example, but he needed their votes in order to get it through. And he had to give them something in order to get those votes. So, in a number of programs, like Social Security, they did not apply to either farm workers or to maids or domestic servants. And of course, these were the two most common occupations of African American Southerners. That applied to Social Security. It applied to the Wagner Act, which is the right to unionize. It applied to the minimum wage law, which was enshrined in another piece of New Deal legislation, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It applied to the protection of a 40-hour work week. If you work more than 40 hours, you're entitled to time and a half. But none of these things applied to farm workers or maids. Now, in the GI Bill, a few years later, toward the end of World War II, this offered a college education to veterans. It's perhaps the most successful piece of social legislation in American history. It was instrumental in the creation of a middle class. But benefits were administered by local officials, which of course in the South meant there was enormous racial discrimination. Also, you couldn't get any college benefits under the GI Bill unless you were admitted to college. And if you were faced with racial barriers to admission, or barriers because you had been denied the education you needed in elementary and secondary school to qualify for college, then you really didn't get the benefit of the GI Bill. Now, in home loans, this applied, and that is an interesting and tragic story. And we're going to go on to the next slide to explore that further. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a New Deal agency, published maps of many, many American cities. Here's the one for the Detroit area. Now, this controlled FHA-backed mortgages, Federal Housing Administration mortgages, which was a way for people to borrow money and have the federal government guarantee those loans. It was a path to home ownership. Now look at Detroit here. You have a few green areas. These are the upper class areas. You'll notice the Grosse Points over here are green. There was no problem getting home loans in those neighborhoods. The blue areas were second grade, but still pretty good. The yellow areas were a lower category, but it was still often possible to get home loans in these areas. But in the red areas, you could not get home loans. The federal government would not lift a finger to help you own a home. Now, here's one of the insidious aspects of this. The mere presence of one black family in a neighborhood got that neighborhood colored red on these maps. So that meant that built right into the structure of this was a denial of home loans for African Americans who wanted to purchase them. Now, how open were these racial attitudes? Was this dog whistle? No, it wasn't. It was right on the surface. Here's a Democrat from Florida. He said, quote, "You cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it." This was not dog whistle racism. There was nothing secret about it. This was open. Now, what was the result of all this? Well, 2/3 of African Americans nationwide and 80% of them in the South were denied one or more of these federal benefits because of these policies that we talked about, whether it was Social Security or the labor protections or the GI Bill or home loans. The vast majority of African Americans were denied at least one or more of these benefits because of these New Deal policies. Now, I should add that Mexican Americans in the Southwest were also devastated by these policies. And all of this continued well into the 1950s. And the answer to this was ultimately the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Now, let's point out here, too, that the largest source of wealth for the middle class is home ownership. So when you're denied the ability to buy a home, this has intergenerational effects. You're not accumulating the wealth as normally home prices would go up and you could sell those You could leave them to your children, but you're denied the benefit of passing on that wealth from one generation to the next. So this is multi-generational. The issue is what is sometimes called intergenerational wealth transfer. And that's something that many, many whites in the middle class have benefited from, but not African Americans. So as a result, you would expect to see an enormous gap in the net wealth of blacks and whites. And in fact, that's what we have today. These are data from the Pew Research Center. And these are expressed in 24s, and these are recent. Notice the net worth of whites is more than 10 times greater than the net worth of blacks on average. So, you know, is slavery over? I mean, have the effects of this horrible system known as America's original sin been put behind us? Here we are 150 years later, and the answer is no, they have not.